Hello, BookTube. December is always a really weird time for book critics, at least for this book critic. It's always a weird space between the old year and whatever's coming in the future. I have finished all my commissions for 2023. My Steve Reads list of the year's best and soon worst books is going up on Open Letters Review for the very last time. It's going to be on Open Letters Review. It's going up every single day, has been for a week, will be for another week, which summarizes the best and worst books of 2023. And in just a couple of weeks, I'm going to disappear. So all of that combines into a weird feeling of unreality. But there are still a whole bunch of December releases. I've been reading them all, doing my best to scramble to the end of the year without missing much from 2023. That's always hopeless. In any year, I look back and realize how much I missed from the year before, but the big releases, or even the big little releases, I like to make sure that I get as many of them as humanly possible, or inhumanly possible in this case, and that gives me some December books to talk about. So I thought I'd make a video about that today. I don't know that I can make another one of these in the time I have left, but I wanted to go through a few books that I have read, December releases, just to talk about them. They are not, as far as I know, not one of these is making a year-end list. Maybe one of them is. So, you know, they're not on those lists, but they might still be of interest to you. They were certainly of interest to me in one way or another. So we'll start with Dr. Stephen Cohen. This is his book, All Bleeding Stops. And this is his memoir about working in a trauma unit at a hospital for decades. He has decades of experience. He's not like he did a year and then had all sorts of smarty pants ideas about what it was like. This draws on a vast amount of experience to tell you what the trauma unit is like at a hospital. So that in itself is both a recommendation and a warning. You know exactly what you're going to get here. So if you're not in the mood to read about sometimes bloody, often tragic life and death decisions at a hospital, then this is not the book for you. And much as I appreciate Dr. Cohen's experience, this is not a book for you if you want to read a story about a trauma unit that is well written. This is pedestrian prose at best, which isn't surprising to me. That is not meant as an insult to the author. It isn't surprising to me that while he was going to med school for 50 years, or however long it takes, and then while he was working in a trauma unit for 40 years, that while he was doing all that, he was not also becoming an excellent writer. Those are two different things. Excellent writing is not a default in your back pocket, waiting until you have a chance to use it. It's a skill. It requires lots and lots and lots of time to hone. So this is much more along the lines of a recommendation for the things that it talks about rather than the way it talks about those things. And the way it talks, the things that it talks about are fascinating. The decisions that you have to make and what it does to you. What it does to you. I knew a trauma surgeon at a fairly major hospital who often had to deal with the results of highway accidents, where he's having a normal, stressful day with people coming in bleeding or throwing up or maybe incredibly contagious and not knowing it, where he's dealing with a normal, stressful day like that when suddenly he gets a phone call that he has 50 patients incoming and some of them are in 16 pieces. Do what you can. You know, it's not, we're shipping you 16 people who are either dead or dying, but we're not shipping you 16 extra doctors. It doesn't matter if you were looking at the clock and you were 15 minutes away from clocking out. You're staying for days. That's the world that's covered here, and it's covered well. So I definitely could recommend it. Then this next one is a bit of a cheat on this list. I saw that it was coming, and I did all the preparation necessary, but I did not actually hold the book in my hand. I do not have, at the moment, publicity contacts for comic books, for either Marvel or DC. Usually that doesn't matter, because usually I'm buying these things as an old fan. If I really, really want it, I'm getting it as an old fan. And usually I have the issues. I have if it's a reprint volume, of course, that's all I'm going to want from Marvel or DC. I'm not going to want anything new they make. I don't care what Batman 8 for lunch. Okay, so I don't need 5 pages on what he ate for lunch and how his server at his restaurant was biracial, bisexual, and neurodivergent. I'm not interested in that at all, and that's the only thing you're going to get in a monthly comic. But the reprints in both companies will reprint stuff that's actually good, stuff that wasn't trying to improve the reader, that was only trying to entertain the reader. And I knew this volume was coming, so I just went and got all my pertinent issues. There's a big hardcover omnibus of the Marvel Comics artwork of Arthur Adams. That's the artist who did this cover. He is a fan favorite. He is a slow and meticulous worker, so it's not like he has any long runs on any issues. He's your guy if you want a miniseries, or if you want, you know, a miniseries within a comic, within an ongoing comic where it's not actually a separate title, but he's only going to be on for 3 or 4 issues. He's the guy you want. Fans will go to him. Your bottom line for that issue will do a lot better if it's Arthur Adams artwork. Same thing is true with his DC artwork as well. And this has just dozens and dozens of the issues that he has done for Marvel Comics. It has his miniseries with a loser character named Longshot that's nevertheless wonderfully drawn. It has his artwork on a couple of annuals and a couple of other characters. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. He also did a 4-issue miniseries within a series about what if the Fantastic Four were suddenly out of commission and you needed 4 different characters to fill that role. And fans of his artwork, and I am definitely one, will have these issues. I have all of them. You go after Arthur Adams' artwork, even if you don't like the title, even if you don't like the characters. You go at it because it's such a joy to watch. It's such a joy to look at. And this collects all of that. Does a remarkably thorough job. I think this has an introduction, a new introduction by Chris Claremont, who was often Arthur Adams' writer. But I'm not losing sleep at night missing that introduction. So I didn't actually hold this volume, but I can still recommend it to you comic book fans, definitely. Then this next one, this is by T.R. Napper. Don't know if that's a pen name. Certainly feels like one. And this indulges in a niche interest of my own, which is fiction based around the Aliens universe that was introduced to viewers in Alien, and then Aliens, and then Aliens 3 Resurrection, and then so on and so forth. There have been video games, there have been comic books, and there have been books. And I have found that the books are often quite good. That's not always true with franchise. I guess we call it franchise fiction. That's not always true with franchise fiction. I've often found that these come from a place of love rather than just naked financial commission, which can often be true with other franchises. And I read one of those. I read Aliens Bishop, by T.R. Napper, which is, as you can tell from the cover, and as you'll know if you know the movies at all, this is about a synthetic organism. There are androids involved in the Aliens world. They are made by the Yutani Corporation, and they are human-like in all ways, but they are superior, they are stronger, they are faster, they have a massive data bank instead of memories. They're just made to look more and more convincingly human. And one of them is a villain in Alien, and one of them is a hero in Aliens, and so on and so forth. Their lore gets more and more complicated, and this is a book about that character. One of those artificial people is called Bishop, and this is a book about that character, and I loved it. I know that when it comes to franchise fiction, your standards are a little lower because the writer, in this case T.R. Napper, doesn't invent the world. They're not inventing any of the major characters. The T.R. Napper did not invent Bishop. He does not invent... he invents characters in this book, including one of them who's directly related to another beloved Aliens franchise character. But the world, the parameters of the world, this author can't change any of those things and didn't invent any of those things. So there's a lower bar here. I don't mean that sounds condescending. I don't mean it to sound condescending. It's just it's a feature of the landscape when it comes to franchise fiction. But even so, there are good ways to do that, deal with that limitation, and bad ways to deal with that. I thought this was wonderful. Just wonderful. And I don't think, there are people who know the Aliens world a lot better than I do, but I don't think it violates any of the in-world continuity of that world. I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't necessarily be looking for that, but if it was really bad, it would jump out at me. And I don't think anything did. Okay, then we have a romance novel by Lana Ferguson. And this thing had a lot of energy. a lot of snappy, book-talky wit to it, but it did not end up satisfying me. It is called The Fake Mate. And it's got one of these dumb cartoon covers. And it's, on the surface, a romance story about a successful young doctor whose mother is pestering her to find a husband. So she takes a familiar route in romance novels and decides she will lie about having a prospective husband, and she sights her sights on the first man she sees, who is a hotshot cardiovascular surgeon. He's not her boyfriend. He's not, so far as she knows, he's not going to be her husband. It's just mainly to get her mother off her back. And those of you who read romance novels will know that is a very familiar gimmick. That is a very familiar plot gimmick. And the fact that it's very familiar does not in any way mean that it can't be good. The Aliens universe is very familiar. It doesn't, not a question of originality. It's a question of execution. And this would have been a clever version of that. I don't mind. See, I could read 100 of those. I do read 100 of those a year. That particular gimmick. It doesn't bother me at all. But you're going to look at a detail on this cover and you're going to wonder what it's doing there. There are paw prints on the floor, and that's because, in addition to that plot gimmick, this is also about werewolves. The young doctors are werewolves, and so is everybody they know. And the hotshot cardiovascular surgeon that our main character sets her sights on is an unbonded male, which I guess in this, I don't know that these characters are ever called werewolves. I think they're called wolf shifters. I don't think the word werewolf ever occurs except in mockery. I guess they're enslaved people. I guess they're unhoused. I guess even in werewolf fantasy romance novels, our language is still being policed. But the world largely knows about these creatures. And I read the thing thinking, okay, that feels carded in. That feels extra in a way that isn't good. There's in a way that isn't good. If you're writing a story about two werewolves who fall in love, who are living in the human world, and they spar at first, and they're not sure they're going to fall in love, and then they do. If you're writing a book like that, okay, fine. If you're writing a novel, a romance novel, in which not only is that happening, but the whole world knows that werewolves exist, that wolf shifters exist, well, then you're required to do a truckload of world building. And there's none of that here. I don't know if this is not Lana Ferguson's first job writing about these kinds of things. I got the impression that it isn't. I didn't research here, and I didn't. If this is part of a series, I didn't go back and conscientiously start at the beginning of the series. I was sort of trusting that the book would make the world sense to me, and it doesn't. Every time the subject came up, I was thinking, okay, but what about this, and this, and this, and this? What about all of these elements that, if the world you're describing is true, would have to be present? Why aren't you dealing with them? So that at the end of it's done with energy. I don't think you will dislike it. But at the end of the book, I was thinking, you should have picked a stool. If you wanted to write a fake romance that becomes real, of course, that's the gimmick of the fake romances, that they always become real. If you wanted to do that, you show in this book that you're easily capable of it. And if you wanted to write a werewolf novel, well, to me, the combination did not work. To me, this was a layer cake that was one layer too high. So maybe you will think different. Then this next one was a huge surprise to me. Didn't know what to expect. Certainly wasn't expecting what I got as to how good it was. This is by Gregory Walance, and it is Into Siberia, George Kennan's epic journey through the brutal frozen heart of Russia. And the minute I saw that title, I thought, there's no chance at all. George Kennan wouldn't go to the brutal frozen wastes of the bottom of his Maryland garden, much less into Siberia. He's perfectly happy to slander Russia, but he's not happy to go there and visit. Then I realized, this book is not talking about my George Kennan. This book is talking about a different George Kennan, a Victorian explorer named George Kennan, who his name, and the minute I realized that I know this author. I know personally, I know this other George Kennan. He went on a massive expedition into Siberia, and he actually wrote a book about it that is fantastic. Tent Life in Siberia is fantastic to read. And this is a new popular history about that expedition. So think about River of Madness. by Candace Millard. Candace Millard wrote a book called River of Madness about Theodore Roosevelt's post-presidency trip into the Brazilian wilderness. And she dramatizes it. She brings to bear a lot of hindsight that isn't present in the great book that Roosevelt himself wrote called In the Brazilian Wilderness. And when that book was all the rage, when everybody was talking about it, my standard for it, even before I got a copy and read it, my standard for it was, well, your book will be a success if it adds something to the story that the original book did not have. Unlike most historians, you are writing, in River of Madness, you are writing an account of an event that already has a terrific account by the person who did the whole thing. It's rare that that happens. It's rare that an explorer will also be a good writer. And George Kennan, not my George Kennan, but this George Kennan, is a very good writer, and he wrote a book about this subject. So does Into Siberia bring any more to the table than Tent Life in Siberia does? And it does. Very much so. This was terrific. Absolutely terrific. I don't know that I've seen it reviewed at all. But, so maybe the advanced copy that I read, maybe it had a problem and it's not out yet. Maybe it's not in bookstores. But if you're a fan of exploration literature, especially if it's full of great characters, this author is terrific at portraying characters. This is actually a wonderful story, regardless of all the amazing things that this George Kennan does. If you're a fan of this kind of writing, Into the Wild or Endurance or whatnot, don't miss this book. It is absolutely terrific. It's just, it threw me for a loop. That's all, as I admit. I admit that for most of the time that I was reading this, I was kind of smiling every time Kennan's name came up, because these are two very different men. And those of you who don't have any idea what I'm talking about, there was, once upon a time, for 270 years, an Eeyore, a sourpuss, in the American Foreign Policy shop, who also was called George Kennan. This is not that George Kennan. This is a George Kennan who would have eaten that George Kennan for breakfast. Stop it, baby. You gotta stop. You gotta stop. If your whole head is up your butt, then you have to stop, or you won't be able to breathe. There's no air inside your body. Sorry. We'll just do a few more here and then we'll wrap up. This next one is by David Whelan. Did not see it coming, which is also true of its subject. The rottenest joke of the day. And it is downright strange. Some of you, this will be catnip. It's catnip to me. Some of you will really want to read this. It's called Mind Games: The Assassination of John Lennon. And it's about the 1980 shooting, the fatal shooting of John Lennon in the doorway of his apartment building in New York. And you might think you know that story because Hinckley didn't flee and he didn't deny it. The assassin just sat down and waited for the police to show up, and has been interviewed a few times since then. This author says that is not the case. This author has a new theory of the crime, saying essentially that, I don't want to spoil things, but that there was a second shooter. And that Hinckley was set up as a kind of zombified robot who would take the fall for the real killer. And David Whelan goes at this subject with a huge, first of all, a huge amount of narrative energy. He's a heck of a writer. You will not be bored by this at all. But also a huge amount of conviction. He goes at all of the original sources. He goes to as many people as are still alive on the police force who are willing to talk to him, as many forensic specialists. He goes at the forensics reports. He goes at all of the ballistics, everything. He re-examines this subject from the ground up. And that is invigorating. That is absolutely invigorating to do. So I love the book. I was never for a single instant persuaded by it. And I don't know that that's all that important. I mean, when you read a book like this, is it important to you that the author eventually succeed in convincing you? It has never been for me. I have read thousands of books on the mother of this kind of writing, the JFK assassination, and I don't ever require that the book successfully convince me. I only require that the book not be crazy, that the author not be crazy. Is the author doing a legitimate job of investigation? That in itself is incredibly fascinating. I think that we in history know perfectly well what happened in this subject. I think we know it in every detail. Okay, all right, I think that. But if you don't think that, I am going to be thrilled if you do a smart, well-written, conscientious job of trying to convince me otherwise, trying to shift my certainty. Whether it's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand or JFK or John Lennon, no matter what it is. If you believe that the Titanic was torpedoed, we know for a fact that did not happen. I'm still going to want to read your book, unless you're nuts. And that's what this is. This was so interesting to read. So much, I hate to say it about such a macabre subject, but it was so much fun to read. To watch this author go at all of what we think we know about this subject. So if that's your line of country, don't miss this. I know that if it's your line of country, you probably already know about this, but maybe not. Maybe this flew below your radar. I don't think it will convince you, but I'm not sure that it has to. I'm not sure that you'll really mind much that it doesn't. Okay, this next one, baby, you have to stop. You have to stop. Hang on just a second here. BookTube. Sorry, this whole video is falling apart, but I'm not going to redo it. You have to stop. All right? You have to stop. All right. Sorry. Okay. Let's go back to the books. This is one of two books on this list that is a Trump book. If I'm going to expand that umbrella to cover books that would not exist if Trump did not exist. If Trump did not exist and had not made and is not continuing to make an ongoing bid for an authoritarian takeover of the United States. If that didn't happen, wasn't happening, that is currently happening. Donald Trump has repeatedly said on what the reporters still insist on calling the campaign trail. He's not campaigning. But he's repeatedly said that he intends to be a dictator if he seizes power. And since that, if that reality did not exist, then a couple of books on this list would not exist either. Even though in the narrow band definition of a Trump book, which is sycophants lying about an idiot real estate hustler from Queens, if that, they're not that specific thing. That accounts for hundreds of books, but these are not them. These are just Trump books in the broader sense of that his existence flushed them out of existence, and they wouldn't be anything like what they are without him. And the first one is pretty famous. I read Liz Cheney's memoir. It's very poorly written. It's very boilerplatey. It's very much what you'd expect of a political memoir. As is mostly the case with books like this, whether it's Adam Kinzinger or anybody else, the writer drastically overestimates how interested you are in them other than their participation in the most important event in American history. Fortunately, Liz Cheney has enough common sense so that is the bulk of this book. Her participation. She torpedoed her own political career and endangered her life and the life of her family in order to say, this guy tried to overthrow the government. His mob tried to have me and my colleagues murdered in our place of work, and he's going to do it again. She was willing to torpedo her entire career to do that. And to put it mildly, not many elected officials were. And there is a spotlight on that in this book, which is good. Those are the historically relevant parts. The historically irrelevant parts of what a horrible politician she was before then. What a revanchist, regressive, bigoted Cheney she was before then. She was no angel before then. She just, when the events of the armed insurrection that Donald Trump plotted for months to orchestrate and then violently incited, when those events happened, they caused a change in the path of her life. If that hadn't happened, well, she might have run for president, and she would have been a horrible, regressive Republican president. But, in other words, I'm not defending her politics at all. But when that moment happened, she was not willing to say this is just an ordinary tourist visit. Tourists don't smear excrement on the walls. They don't steal things. They don't mace and bear spray police officers. She wasn't willing to say that out of fear of the mobster who incited it all. She was instead she faced, in this book, she portrays it fairly well. A better ghostwriter would have portrayed it even better. She faced a genuine moment of emotional reckoning, of personal honor, and made the right decisions. Which is, when you reach that moment, you never know what's going to happen. Well, you could be a person of honor your whole life and make an honorless decision, or you could be a scoundrel who kicks down at marginalized people for your whole life, and then in that moment make the right decision. You never know. So I had to read this. Of course, I had to read it. It is historically important. Not nearly as important as everything that's going to happen from 2024 on, but still historically important. It is not a good reading experience. I'm reporting it now because it's part of December reading, but you shouldn't read it. This is one of those instances where I would strongly suggest you just read about it instead. Rather than wait. Most of you are not like me. Most of you, your reading time is far more precious than mine is, and there's far less of it. So I'm mentioning it of note. Unless you're a junkie on these kinds of books, I'd give it a wide berth. And then this next one, well, this next one won a major literary award. That doesn't mean anything anymore because the major literary awards have been ideologically captured. But it adds an interesting footnote because I have been unable to discover where the ideology is here. It has to be so. It must be present. I just have been unable to discover what it is. Of course, it's Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which is the other Trump book. I mean, the last thing in the world that I would choose to describe this thing, but it's about an Ireland that is relatively quickly tipping into authoritarianism. It's about a normal world with normal people living a normal, free life, but all of a sudden this thing starts to happen to their world. So it's about 2023 America as well, and it's very much Paul Lynch's observations about what people will do in that circumstance. I can't figure it out because as far as I can tell, I've been resistant doing what all the literary judges do, which is do a deep dive on the personal life of the author, a deep dive on the author's social media accounts. They don't look at the books anymore. They don't read the books anymore, except with one exception, one literary prize for 2024. Otherwise, no. They don't even consider the book's literary merit anymore. They just look at whether or not where the author ranks on the progressive stack. And as far as I can tell, Paul Lynch is not on the progressive stack at all. I can't figure it out. The book, though, this is also going to be tricky. This video isn't specifically to make recommendations. I strongly recommend Into Siberia. Those of you who love that kind of adventure reconstruction books are going to love it. It's a classic of the genre. This is a very Irish book. It's very, when it comes to the literary world, the Irish march to the beat of their own drummer, and they make their own choices, and they try their own risks. In a saner world, that would probably have gotten this book strongly considered. I don't think it was the best entry on the Booker shortlist, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this is not at all easy reading, and it's not meant to be. And I don't mean just the subject matter. I mean the way it's written. Just block after block after block, page after page after page after page of uninterrupted prose. Uninterrupted by any breaks, uninterrupted for dialogue, uninterrupted for pace or change of scene. Just groping reading experience. Now, it doesn't take more than 2 seconds for you to understand why the author would want to make that the kind of reading experience that goes along with the events narrated in this book. It doesn't take long to figure that out. You won't, it's not rocket science. You can see it in a heartbeat. Why an author would want to make this book difficult to read. But understanding that authorial choice is not at all the same thing as wanting to live with it for however long it would take you to read this book. So I understand completely if you don't want to. If you don't want to do that. I did, and I was rewarded. This is, in parts, brilliant. It's not as many parts as a couple of other entries on the shortlist, but it's in part, sometimes in long parts, brilliant. It may be remembered in Irish literature. It may be remembered as a book, but you're going to have to. If I were you, I strongly recommend that you find this at the library. Since it's one the Booker, you'll have to be on a waiting list to get it at the library. But I think probably on Amazon or Kobo, there are samples. There's a free sample that you can download. Definitely try it first. Try a small sample first, because the small sample is the way it's going to go on. And you might say, if you are a strong, adventurous reader, thank God, most of my viewers are genuine readers. You're not just skimming along. We're genuine adventurous readers. If you are a genuine adventurous reader, there is absolutely no shame in looking at this and saying, I'm not going to live with that for 300 pages. I'm just not going to do it. No matter whether Steve says it's really good or not, no matter who says it's really good or not, I'm not going to do it. There's no shame in that decision. That is a completely valid decision. This is style as well as substance, and the style was chosen intentionally to be inimical to reading. So whether or not you want to read it is entirely going to be an outcome of that decision on the author's part. So I wanted to bring it to your attention. Now this next one, this is by historian Stephen Moore, who as far as I know is not an institutional historian or academic historian of any kind, and boy oh boy can you tell that. This is like his millionth book. And here, readability will not be an issue. Not at all. This is unbelievably readable. This is World War II history. So if you know somebody who's into World War II history, or you are yourself, you might want to consider putting this on the list. This is also World War II microhistory. This is not a sweeping 1,000-page volume of the war, all hell let loose or whatever. This is not that. This is a very particular, tightly focused story. If you like that kind of history, and you like World War II history and you somehow missed this, this has to go on your list. This is called Strike of the Sailfish. And it's the story of two submarines, one of which is doing routine test patrol off the coast of Maine when it sinks. And a chunk of the men on board die, but a chunk of the men don't. They manage to make it to watertight compartments. And they are rescued by another submarine that's very similar in its make and manner, model to the Squalus, the submarine that goes down off the coast of Maine. They are rescued. And this is all on page 2. The author does an incredibly breathless job of narrating how you go about rescuing men who are trapped on a downed submarine in pitch black, freezing cold water. And once the men are rescued, they are successfully rescued, the ship is then rescued. It's a huge amount of hardware, and it wasn't torpedoed or anything, it just sank. So you can rescue it, you can renovate this incredibly advanced machine for its time. So a huge salvage operation is done. And there are photographs, there are photographers on board when attempts are made, first one that doesn't work and then another that does, to bring it to the surface, tow it in, and get it refurbished. One of the photographs of the first attempt, when the submarine gets all the way to the surface, it breaks the surface, the turrets and all break the surface before it slips out and falls to the bottom and has to be rescued again. That photograph, one of those photographs was famous, and one of the people that saw it was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said that it reminded him of a sailfish breaking the surface of the water. And so when the sub was eventually successfully salvaged and refitted, it was named the Sailfish. It was renamed the Sailfish. And it went about its business for World War II. No vacations, no furloughs, no time off, straight back to patrolling the water. World War II broke out in earnest, and the Sailfish was out in the water, out in the open ocean, including in the South Pacific when it encountered two things. A gigantic typhoon and a Japanese aircraft carrier group that did not appear to know the Sailfish was there, and certainly didn't expect the Sailfish to attack in the middle of a typhoon. The captain of the Sailfish decides, that's what we're here for. I know that no other sub has ever taken out an aircraft carrier, but we're going to do that. Or at least we're going to try, and maybe we'll die, but we're going to try to do that. That's what we're here for. We're not here to say to look and then run. And what the Sailfish doesn't know is that in that aircraft carrier's holds are survivors of the ship that rescued them off the coast of Maine all those years ago. That ship was sunk, and survivors bobbed in the water and were rescued by the Japanese. That's a very air quotey word. They were brutalized, and a lot of them were sent to a copper mine, and that is described in this book in riveting detail. This author had to do a huge amount of primary source digging to find out the details of this story. And he does a magnificent job with it. This is just amazingly readable from start to finish. So I strongly, strongly recommend it. The only thing dictating the recommendation is the same one that applies to so many other things. If you're not a comic book reader, you're not going to care about an Arthur Adams and omnibus edition. If you're not a huge fan of the Aliens franchise, then you're not going to care about Aliens Bishop, regardless of how good it is. If you're not a fan of true crime and alternate narrative challenging narratives, then you're not going to care about Mind Games. Same thing is true with all these things. I just thought I would mention it anyway. If this is your niche, World War II histories that are written like action-adventure novels, then this is for you. Absolutely. I wanted to make sure you knew about it. And this next one is definitely a niche. All of these things are niches. This is by Ken Stagel. I don't know. It's a niche of mine. Definitely. This is called Two Roads to Heaven. And there you have, famously, a turtle on a fence post. So where, you know, the saying goes, the one thing you know about a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there on its own. That metaphor has been employed by a million different people. This is a study of Romans in the New Testament, which is a favorite field ground of study of my own. So I would have been drawn. I would have read this book anyway. It's in Romans that a lot of what Christians consider to be the word of Christ is laid out, not by Christ at all, but by St. Paul. And it's Romans that really puts in the crucible whatever idea of whatever kind of a Christian you are. You might not know that. You might not have studied Romans on your own, but trust me, or read, or read Romans. Most of the ideological, personal, and emotional cruxes of Christianity come from there, rather than from the Gospels. The Gospels are a little too simple. They're a little too straightforward. Most Christians don't want to do what's in the Gospels. They would rather have it complicated by a man. Most of them don't want the dictates, pure and simple, that most Christians don't want that. Most Christians are rather fond of not turning the other cheek. They're rather fond of their freedom not to do that. So they turn to Romans. I don't mean to make this all theological in the weeds, but this book touts itself as a study of Romans, and that's a stretch. I have read thousands of studies of Romans. This is much more of a personal encounter with them. This is it's very winningly done. And I don't believe that it calling itself a study in Romans is a lie. It is certainly the author's study of Romans. But it's far more a faith memoir than it is exegesis or theology. It's far more that. I liked it. I thought it was good. Maybe not memorably good, but it wasn't dumb, and it wasn't derivative. So often when I see people doing faith studies or faith walk studies, whether it's Romans or Colossians or Galatians or whatever, so often I will open that. They always open with a personal introduction, a personal statement about family and your path of faith and whether or not you reached the bottom and where and how that happened and when you realized that this particular doctrine, this particular part of doctrine was going to be your road to salvation. So many times these books start that way, and then they descend into you just regurgitating someone else's book that you read. You're not grappling with the text yourself. That's not true here, and I think that was the thing that charmed me, is that that's not true here. I might not appreciate the way that the author grapples with Romans, but this is the book boils down to salvation, how you achieve salvation. Can you do it on your own? Can you help it? Can you nudge the process along? Or do you only get on that fence post because someone put you there? And it's well done. So if this is your niche, I have a number of niches. That's why they get so many of them here. If this is your niche, then that it'll work for you. And then we'll finish up. This video has gone long. Good Lord, I could do this all day. So we'll finish up with just one more. This is Barbara Taylor Bradford. So this is a kind of romance, but I wouldn't call it romance. I would call it more, the old term for it used to be women's fiction. I don't know if that term is allowed anymore. But think about Lavril Spencer. Well, Barbara Taylor Bradford is a really good example. And she's been doing a historical series. A series of historical novels about a self-made man who becomes fantastically wealthy, and all the people in his orbit and all the descending members of that family for the last 100 years. The Falconer series. And I like them. I really do. I don't know the story behind these books. I've heard rumors. To me, they very much read like an older and practiced author, someone who's been a bestseller for most of her life, most of her professional career, who has decided, who's learned along the way and has stripped out a lot of the excess from her narratives. So I actually like the Falconer novels. This is the latest one. It's The Wonder of It All, and it came out in December. As you can tell, you know, from the cover, you don't need any clues from the cover to know this. This is just continues the family. So this won't... Efforts were made on the part of Barbara Taylor Bradford, or if she's got a co-writer, an unacknowledged co-writer. Efforts were definitely made to make this stand on its own for you if you haven't read any other Falconer novels, but I don't think those efforts are successful. I don't know what you would get out of this book. I was keeping one eye cocked on what you would get out of this book if you hadn't read any of the others, if you're just approaching this. I don't know. There are chunks of these narratives. One character in particular, I don't think it will resonate with you at all, much less anywhere near as much as would if you'd read the other books. So I guess what I'm recommending here is the Falconer series. No harm in that. There's no slight in that. Some authors write books and series their whole career. And also, while I'm qualifying my recommendation, I would recommend that you start the Falconer series at the beginning. And while I'm qualifying that recommendation, I would qualify it a little further and, you know, maybe make sure that you like Barbara Taylor Bradford. Because although this is, I think, very much the author in Winter, it's still very much the author. So maybe find, you know, one of the big overstuffed books that she wrote decades ago and try that. And for that, you wouldn't need the library. I don't think your library will have a backlist for this author. I don't think so. I want to hear about it. If you're really, really familiar with your library, some of you have little libraries that I would kill to have. I have a huge library. Some of you have much smaller libraries in the Boston Public Library that are much better, far more responsive to readers. That's now a mystery to me, considering all the legislative and procedural hoops that everybody at the Boston Public Library has to jump through. But still, a little heartbreaking. But fortunately, in this case, you won't need your library to have all of her backstock because your nearest Annie's Book Swap, your nearest, you know, Goodwill, your nearest used bookstore will probably have some of her novels. Try one of those maybe, rather than this. But if one of you is in the exact same niche that I am, I have sort of liked this author for her whole career, and I've liked the Falconer novels. If you're in that same niche, well, The Wonder of It All is terrific. You won't be sorry at all for this latest volume. And there you go. Sorry for the length. Oh my God, this is almost an hour long. Those are just some December books that I have read, that I wanted to talk about, and a couple of them really enthusiastically recommend. They aren't all recommends, but I like to think that, you know, there's something for you to grab onto in any one of them. I don't think any one of the things that I mentioned is a failure. Even The Fake Mate. If you are, for instance, deeply steeped in shifter romance, well, this is going to be right up your alley. I'm not. So even the Liz Cheney book, I can't recommend it narratively, but it is an undeniably historically important work. She is an undeniably important historical figure, even now. This is before she is executed in Times Square. So she's an important and historically important figure, whereas a lot of Trump books are written by people who aren't and are never going to be. So all these things are recommendations of a kind, some more enthusiastic than others. So I just thought I'd make a list for you. I don't know, I could do 100 more of these, but I don't know how much interest there would be in that. But I'm going to wrap this up for now so I don't just keep going on about these books. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.